if you're an evaluation geek, I think it can be, and I'm a self-confessed evaluation geek, I think it can be really hard to carve out the time to make sure that we're thinking about evaluation and how evaluation affects and enhances our work at the moment. So I really do appreciate people taking the time out to do that at the moment. As we're changing all of our ways of working, it feels like there's a huge amount to evaluate at the moment, and a whole bunch of new things that are yet to have been tried and tested, and not a whole lot of literature that we can base our theories of change on. So this is exciting times, but also some very challenging times. So thank you for taking your time to be here. Why on earth is Villas Park hosting a conference about why evaluate? It's a really good question. We were delivering this originally in partnership with the University of Sheffield, and then the world suddenly changed almost overnight, and we were no longer able to deliver a physical conference. Julian and I, those of you who know us, and I think most of you do, remain as ever very committed to evaluation, and it seemed like a really good opportunity to support the sector in making sure that these conversations carried on despite COVID. Villas Park is a national charity. We work with 11 to 19-year-old disadvantaged young people to raise their academic achievement and enhance their agency in life. We particularly focus on a possible selves model and seek to develop skills in curiosity, tenacity and creativity, so that people are able to make choices that give them the very best chances of the best outcomes in their lives that suit them. We have a new strategy, which I'm sure you've all read on our website, and we are focusing on the impact of our programs, the reach of the young people that we work with, and influencing the policy environment that we're working in. Now, it seems to me that all three of those things, for them to work at all, let alone work well, evaluation is absolutely core. So Villas Park remains incredibly committed to evaluating and evaluating well. I'm not going to waffle on for very much longer, but hand you over to our fantastic and esteemed panel of Chris, Julian and Gino, who are going to talk to us about COVID-19 as a disruptor, learning from failure and reflexive practice, all topics that I think are probably at the forefront of people's minds right now. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. The way we're going to do this is if you use the chat box and post questions, then I will do my best to gather and curate those and then put them to the panel at the end. It would be particularly helpful. Let me go back. One of the things that's been lovely about doing these conference sessions online is that people have had the opportunity to chat about what's going on in the chat box, and that's fantastic, and I would really encourage you to do that. It's a really good way of enhancing some of that thinking and the conversation. And I'm quite severely dyslexic, or very severely dyslexic, and so reading through conversations and questions to try and pick out the questions will be quite challenging for me. It seems to me that an easy solution is, if you would like to post a question that you want me to ask the panel, just simply put a capital Q at the beginning of the question, and I will be able to pick those out much, much easier than if I have to read the detail of all the texts. So if you've got a question for the panel, fantastic, please ask it. It makes the second half of these sessions much more interesting. If you want to do that, stick a capital Q at the beginning of your question and post it in the text box, and I will ask it in due course. Thank you very much, and I will hand over to Julian.
That's great. Thanks very much. Just to check, on my screen, it looks like the slideshow's not running. Have you all got the full slideshow on your screens? No. Okay, let's try. Sorry about this. Is that better? Yeah, great. Whew. Okay, so the session today came out of a conversation that Chris, Gino and myself were having about kind of the weird world that we currently inhabit. because of the current COVID crisis. And we were doing a bit of kind of trying to think about what it might look like when we emerge from the other side. And we were thinking about our own practices as kind of outreach or practitioners or managers and evaluators, and thinking about how our current interests might impact on the way that we think about what happens next. And we both, all three of us, realised that through evaluation and through running activities, we'd all encountered things that had gone wrong and broken, and that in fact we'd actually learned a lot from those. So I'm just going to do a very quick introduction, then we're going to each give you a case study of things that fell apart and what we learned to take forward. And we're offering that as a kind of a confidence in getting things wrong, but also potentially a way to think about how COVID as a disruptor and something that's broken things might encourage us to use evaluation reflective practice in the world beyond COVID. Okay, so I'm just starting off with a couple of quotes. The "everything is broken" bit came from Radiohead's song Planet Telex, which I'm more than happy to quote. I'm less happy to quote Coldplay, but again, that's the same kind of idea of things going wrong, failing, and then there's the quintessential Samuel Beckett quote: "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better." And that seems to be sort of at the heart of our reflexive practice and our willingness to learn. So obviously we're in the current situation of adjusting to the COVID-19 world. Obviously it's had a massive impact globally. All global citizens are affected by it. It's kind of smashed the markets, but it's also a very personal situation as well, having very personal impacts in terms of our everyday life, and also obviously the kind of health impacts, the fact that thousands of people are becoming ill and unfortunately sometimes dying as well. So we've got a micro and a macro level set of things going on at the same time. And in a way, Chris, Gino and I were saying that COVID-19 has effectively broken every normal life. And it's hard to think about what life might be like when we put it back together again. So COVID-19's obviously also broken our kind of professional lives as well. It's changed the way we do outreach, widening participation and evaluation. Social distancing's had an impact. We're all locked down. There's a high degree of economic uncertainty and educational uncertainty as well. And obviously the news is this morning was around the disruption, that the impact of disrupted education is disproportionately felt by the most disadvantaged young people. We've got concerns around health and well-being in terms of the virus, but also mental health as well, and what it might do for us to adapt to this change. And for most of it, it's resulted in new modes of working. So we're used to working from home a lot more. We don't see each other in the same way we used to. And that got me thinking about, you know, on one hand, we've got the tragedy of COVID-19. It's impacting on individuals, people are suffering, people are losing people. But there's also another side to it as well, which is the kind of the more macro level impacts. And I was thinking about kind of other kinds of models of taking things breaking or things falling apart and actually thinking about how they might generate a new reality, and they might actually in some ways produce a more positive outcome. So apologies to any sociologists in the house, I'm going to abuse your discipline now. So Schumpeter was talking about creative destruction in capitalism, that capitalism's always forced to develop, things break, the old models stop working, so it constantly evolves and mutates into something that's kind of more suitable for the current context. And that got me thinking about sort of the risk society and reflexivity, and Beck and Giddens, the way that future society thinks about risk, thinks about change, thinks about the way that what it does will change its own future. And so you've got a kind of a constant way of thinking about how society is, what's going on, what might happen, and how it should change. And that got me thinking about Margaret Archer's discussions of individual reflexivity, and the way that individuals reflecting on their own situation and position, their relationship to society, can make social change possible. So there's kind of these models in which potentially negative outcomes could lead to kind of positive changes. What we talked to, Gino, Chris and I talked about were that things breaking and going wrong, if we take a reflexive approach to that, can lead to new way of doing things. And what's important is how we learn from these failures and the break-ins and how we respond to them. So what we'd like to do is present some case studies of things that have gone wrong, and talk about how we responded, how we'll do things differently. So I'll hand over to Chris now.
Okay, thanks, Julian. First thing to say, people can probably notice that these slides are non-branded, and I just feel I've got to say this before I start, because this is like my first day of a furlough period, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the institution that I work for today, and it'll become clear anyway, because it has no relation to the place that I work at the moment. It's a project from a previous institution. So basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of a project that I led on when I worked at the University of Liverpool. So basically, Julian, do you want to knock it on there? That's great. So basically, where I met Ray, Julian and Gino was on the Offer WP Practitioners course, which was a real honour to kind of be involved in, actually, and it kind of encouraged me to be a lot more reflective, I think, as a practitioner. On the first day, we were talking in groups really about our motivations to do the course, and there were a couple of people who were writing about white working class males at the time, because it was quite an in vogue topic at that moment. And I just remember vividly, Julian may or may not remember this, but somebody on the table sort of talked about how, like, I'm maybe paraphrasing what they said here slightly, but they said something along the lines of white working class boys, essentially at the end of the day, they're unsuccessful. And the quote or the comment, it annoyed me a little bit really, and it kind of made me reflect on sort of my own like sort of learning journey and kind of some of the people who I grew up alongside, who I was friends with or were friends of friends. So all of these people on the screen here are in some form kind of either from the area in which I grew up or played for like a same junior football team as me in one case, played alongside me in another case. And they've probably, with the exception of like Joey Barton, who I think did a talk at the Oxford Union because he fancies himself as a little bit of a philosopher, they've all probably never been anywhere near a university other than to sort of accept an honorary doctorate. So it kind of got me thinking really about sort of what we mean by success and whose barometer kind of we're looking at when we're talking about success with this particular cohort. Okay, do you want to flick on? We know that white working class boys in higher education is an ongoing challenge. I noticed Neil Raven is on the call and he's kind of already reached out to me to say hello. Basically, about this time last year, Neil did an excellent presentation at the University of Liverpool, but the first sort of words that he said were a little bit depressing, really, because he sort of said in the interim period between the last time he spoke with the University of Liverpool and now, not a great deal has changed, really. So you can sort of see there that, you know, kind of it is an ongoing challenge, and the literature kind of identifies this and why it is. So a lot of young men sometimes think of higher education as something that isn't for them. Maybe that there isn't a return on investment in terms of the kind of the fees that they're having to pay to go to university. So it kind of sort of chimed a little bit with my thinking around kind of why the challenge is ongoing. If you want to just flick on again, please. So basically, and again, that's great. So the project itself, anyone remember who this person is? She seems quite sort of dormant, really, and irrelevant now, but she was up until recently kind of the widely recognised as the worst prime minister in history. But that seems to sort of change each time the ministerial sort of makeup changes as well. But on the kind of steps of Downing Street in 2016, one of the first things that she said was this quote around sort of white working class boys. And obviously then as a cohort, they became something of a flavour of the month again. And that is a little bit of kind of one of the things I kind of come back to or would be interested to talk about with people today, how cohorts kind of seem to come and go as kind of something that is in vogue, but the challenge remains. So, you know, whilst white working class boys still are kind of massively underrepresented in HE, perhaps not as much ministerial attention is being paid to them currently as was 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, just knock on again. So where this project came from, I used to lead the NNCO project in Merseyside and then sort of moved into the NCOP project. Those of you who have kind of worked on those two things or have been involved in WP will know that they were different projects with different levels of target and different levels of monitoring and evaluation, different levels of importance played that. But as I say, kind of the challenge remains the same, and there was a lot of noise being made at the time around white working class boys being kind of a group that we wanted to do more with. As I say, kind of the shift from one project to another brought its own challenges, both in terms of like liaison with schools, liaison with staff internally and externally. But we piloted the project in 2017 that basically followed what you might call a very traditional aspiration raising model, which featured university visits and mentoring sessions and ended with a London residential. Okay, knock that on. Basically, the project itself was kind of limited in terms of its success. And I think what I realized from the initial delivery and then the conversations that I had with teachers was that kind of this in and of itself wasn't enough, and we had to actually do something that was more coherent and more kind of focused towards the cohort that we were working with. So trying to sort of move it beyond kind of this sort of slightly outdated aspiration raising model and kind of move it to something that actually resonated more with the actual participants. Knock that on again. Also, I think one of the things that's interesting to sort of analyse, this is taken from a presentation that a former colleague was scheduled to do at a NEON conference. And the bits that I've highlighted to me sort of show that sometimes practitioners are guilty of kind of reinforcing deficit model sort of perceptions. So you can see here sort of reference to Connor being allowed to take a higher paper in maths, like the sort of language around sort of getting a last chance. It's kind of sort of reinforcing sort of some of the things I think that we're almost, well, we should be challenging really. So I thought that that was quite interesting as well. Just knock it on again. So phase 2 of the project, so phase 1, as I say, we had some limited successes. Phase 2 was delivered in Knowsley, which when we're talking about white working class males is probably a borough which is kind of much more fitting, because you're not really going to get much more white and working class than Knowsley. If anybody has ever heard anything about Knowsley, it's probably negative. So there's kind of some of the kind of sort of, you know, headlines that we sort of see. So, you know, they were kind of chosen to be almost like a guinea pig borough for their schools for the future. They redesigned all of the high schools without actual classrooms or any borders between the classrooms, and so-called parents that lacked sort of aspiration for their children acted accordingly and took the kids out of the high schools in that borough, and they went to like high school in like Liverpool or Sefton. But anyway, so yeah, so you want to just knock it on again there. So what did we try to do about this? Well, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a meeting that was coordinated by the local council on a project that was called Knowsley Better Together. And this was a real positive attempt to be a force for change, I think, and it was an attempt to be a sort of multi-agency approach to kind of a problem that was existent within the borough, but was kind of not exactly the borough's fault due to kind of funding cuts in various different services. Basically, in the first meeting, I sort of sat there, listened, observed, and then talked a little bit about my own lived experience in Knowsley, about how when I was choosing whether to go to sixth form or not, you were actively encouraged by your teachers not to go to Knowsley Community College. And if you wanted to go to a university, let alone a top university, you should go to Carmel or witness sixth form or one of the colleges in Liverpool. And obviously everyone kind of was like, oh yeah, but it seemed as though in the sort of intervening 10 to 15 years, that challenge had moved from being a post-16 challenge to, at the point of 11 years of age, the primary schools perform very well in Knowsley, but due to what I've referred to before, a lot of parents choose to send their kids outside the borough for secondary education. One final thing to just mention on this that I think is really interesting, the Director of Children's Services that I've referred to here, he wasn't an educationalist by background, he was a social worker. So rather than kind of, as I've seen in other kind of local authority roles and conversations, you see people sometimes with that role kind of trying to dictate to teachers. He was very different. He sort of wanted to listen to educationalists and learn from them. And he kind of was very sort of interested in this project and wanted it to be a flagship part of the initiative. Okay, do you want to come on again? So basically, it was much more of a genuine co-production model. Again, it was quite a different sort of to the norm, really, because the head teacher and deputy head in the schools that were in one of the two schools that were involved in the programme, they attended the school themselves, so they understood kind of what the challenges were facing the young people, much more than maybe in the pilot phase in Liverpool. They sort of ripped up the first phase and basically developed something that I think would actually resonate with the young people a lot more, and we applied that in terms of what we did in phase two. Knock on again. So basically there's some sort of images. We basically did a number of different interventions, some of which were related to employment, some of which were related to kind of getting the young people to see that things that they were interested in, such as football, maybe had a lot more employment opportunities than maybe initially sort of strike them. Yeah, if you want to just knock it on again. So the project itself, it basically was a lot more successful than the first phase. The schools reported a great degree in terms of improvement, in terms of attendance, punctuality, engagement in general day-to-day school life. As a result of sort of the interventions and exposure to employment opportunities, I think we sort of saw kind of, you know, progression being sort of outlined a little bit more. And I moved on from the University of Liverpool to Lancaster sort of midway through this project, but was fortunate enough to be invited by Ant Sutcliffe and Hannah Merry from Higher Horizons Plus, who I think are on this call today, to the End residential. And when I walked in sort of there to see this group, they were kind of unrecognisable from the lads who I'd sort of seen 6 months earlier. So there was a real sort of development, I think, in terms of their maturity. You want to knock on again? Then in terms of the impact, so, you know, you can sort of see on the slides there, not all of them kind of progressed on to further education, and therefore, you know, it'd be interesting to see how many of them progress on to higher education, which again, I'm sort of just being a bit provocative here. Obviously the outcome of NCOP was to try and get more young people into HE at point of entry at 18, but starting a project with them at year 9, in the case of these lads, year 10, a hell of a lot of kind of stuff has to try and be undone in quite a short space of time. So, you know, it's not surprising that like sort of 15 of them took up apprenticeship opportunities, and there's nothing wrong with that. And probably with a like national employer like MJ Quinn, they might have the opportunity to go through that kind of apprenticeship route back into HE. But I just think in terms of sort of like the outcomes for the lads are obviously very good, but they're not necessarily what the funders expect. But is what the funders expect realistic, particularly when you're starting at such a late point in a learning journey? You want to knock it on again? Cheers. So yeah, I mean, I think reflecting on the two projects side by side, there were obviously some very clear successes, both in terms of like individual success stories, the cohort as a whole, the strength of the links between the two schools, which Kirby's a very parochial community, but two schools never really had any history of doing anything together apart from fighting, which they now kind of, they maybe still do that, but they do definitely work together a lot more than they did before. The two schools are also rolling out interventions from year 7 upwards with this particular cohort, and they've extended it as well to kind of include girls as well, because I know that's always been one of the criticisms of interventions that sort of target white working class boys. Better Together, the Knowsley Council-led initiative, sadly came and went, and to me, that was a really sad thing, because it was clearly a positive force for change. And the guy in question, Paul Boyce, is now Director of Children's Services in the Wirral, so I'm sure he'll probably be doing something quite similar over there, listening to people. Again, he was replaced by somebody who, as it says there, understands the system more, but by that, what she deemed as a priority wasn't kind of the holistic stuff that he did, and I think probably she was at loggerheads with head teachers quite quickly. If you want to move it on again, I'm just going to finish up now. So basically, I think this multi-agency approach was crucial in terms of trying to understand and sort of, solve a long-standing thing. In Knowsley, we talk a lot about like the cycle of deprivation, 2nd and 3rd, 4th generation unemployed. It's not something that universities can solve in isolation. I think the understanding of kind of the regional wants, needs and enthusiasms were kind of integral to the success of these things. And the teachers really understood the kids. So the next step would have been probably to actually involve the lads in a co-production. So I can see your questions there. If I'd have still been working at Liverpool, that would have been the obvious next step. And at Lancaster, we've taken some steps to kind of do this with organisations such as Reclaim and Youth Focus Northwest. Because again, these organisations that work with young people from working class backgrounds and apply sort of youth work, social work kind of models in terms of their engagement with them. Last thing for me to say, and this is just a reflection in terms of how, if you want to knock it on again, there's the sort of final reflection from me is obviously I met Gino, Julian and Ray on the writing project. One of the things that was kind of clear in my piece of writing was kind of this idea of a life cycle model. You just need to push a button just for it to kind of come up again. There should be like a little kind of time frame comes through. Oh no, well, anyway, oh yeah, there we go. So basically, kind of the life cycle model as I see it's kind of sort of outlined there, and how this project kind of could and should feed into something like a pathway for progression. Because again, my critique of things like the first phase of NCOP, you're starting far too late in the learning journey. Kind of some of the stuff I've seen external up in Scotland, the Caledonian Club, for example, they're working with young people and their families, which I think is hugely important, from sort of 4 and 5 onwards, which I think is something that we probably need to learn from in this country. So yeah, that's me. I'll shut up now and hand over to the others.
Okay, thanks, Chris. The intervention I'm going to talk about was much smaller scale than the much bigger program that Chris was talking about. It was a kind of pilot activity, and we were the university I used to work at responded to the kind of pressure from Offer and from government to see universities involved in attainment raising with disadvantaged young people, given that we know that attainment's one of the big barriers that will prevent young people following an educational pathway into higher education. So the guidance from Offer at the time was that universities should seek opportunities to work with schools to help them improve their attainment. So the first thing that struck us was, well, that's a pretty big ask, given that attainment's a highly complex area. And, from the perspective of the DFE, they talked about how attainment raising actually crossed a lot of different departments and public services. So we sort of that complexity on board and thought we should probably, in terms of activities, focus on something quite specific. So we wanted to focus on GCSE Maths and English. We decided to drop the English part to make it more manageable. And what we wanted to focus on was the curriculum issues in Maths GCSE. We're also concerned because I think we felt uncomfortable with an approach to HE-based attainment raising that teachers are working often in very difficult circumstances, under pressure, under-resourced, across a concentrated period. With the best will in the world, most university delivered outreach could only dip in for short amounts of time or for a relatively small number of interventions. So we felt very uncomfortable being asked to claim that we'd changed attainment compared to teachers who work with young people across a much longer time period. We knew that schools were poorly resourced and under pressure, and teachers were often having to balance the needs of individual students against working with a class cohort, and we were really aware of the danger of seeming disrespectful to the teachers working in really difficult situations. So we kind of went back and thought about it, and we were digging around and sort of started exploring the idea of threshold concepts, which is the idea that in kind of educational development or young people following particular courses would hit certain conceptual blocks that were crucial to further progression, and that would stop them from progressing on their course of study because there were certain concepts or certain sets of understanding that didn't work for them and they weren't able to grab hold of and to make that next step. So Mayer and Land kind of first came up with the term of threshold concepts, and as Breen and O'Shea said, threshold concepts have been described as portals opening up a new and previously inaccessible view of a topic, a view without which students would be unable to fully progress intellectually. So we had that kind of idea of threshold concepts, and we thought, well, what about if we train outreach mentors to work with individual students and to address specific threshold concepts that teachers told us that young people would struggle with, and that in that way we're supporting the students by giving them additional capacity to do work that they might want to do but not be resourced to do. So we could have a very sort of close mentor relationship with individual students and help them overcome the threshold concepts that they were struggling with. We're also quite chuffed because we felt that would give us a kind of quite an exciting evaluation opportunity, and that we had clear measures because we would be looking at specific current knowledge, so we could test that and we could check academic process in that way. We could do pre-post tests, so we've got the change across time. We would be able to administer these maths tests to counterfactual participant group, which would give us a kind of a quasi-scientific counterfactual group that we could use to make a causal claim on our work. And we were quite chuffed because we thought, well, that will enable us to tick three of the OFS evidence types. So the implementation plan that we had was recruit participant schools, adopt a suitable online platform to do the mentoring, form teacher advisory groups so that they can tell us which threshold concepts we should target in the project, develop targeted tests for those particular curriculum concepts, recruit mentors, preferably students studying for maths-related subjects, recruit our participants, get agreement from the schools to access and test a counterfactual group, deliver the pre-test, roll out the mentoring, deliver the post-test, Bob's your uncle, everything's great. So that was the plan. And then things started not to go according to plan. So we were successful in recruiting the 3 schools. We found a really good online mentoring platform. I'm not going to name them just in case there's any danger of spillover from this project that might impact on the reputation, but it was an excellent platform. The thing started going a bit awry when we tried to recruit our teacher advisory group. Only 2 teachers across the 3 schools were able to attend, and we found ourselves having to work through year heads. The real difficulties happened when we started developing the targeted evaluation tests. The idea was that we would create an academic test that tested aptitude for these particular concepts. And unfortunately, we found that schools actually run their curriculum at different times and across different time frames. So whereas, I might have assumed that all schools would be doing the same things at the same time, that wasn't the case. And we were only resourced to write one set of tests. So we had to identify a set of curriculum concepts that would be used by all 3 schools. And that was difficult for the schools because the concept that we chose to focus on wasn't necessarily relevant for all of their pupils at that time. So we recruited the mentors, got a lot of really good student mentors who were doing maths-based degrees. We recruited our participants. As anyone who's tried to set up any kind of counterfactual group will know, it's really difficult to get agreement from schools to test a non-participant groups. And it was difficult for us to schedule the pre-test for non-participants. We delivered the pre-test to the participant group, and we found some resistance from the young people participating because they didn't really see the need for a pre-test. They didn't want to take what felt like an extra test. So we rolled out the mentoring program, and we found that engagement wasn't what we wanted. We didn't get the sign up we'd hoped. Young people were missing appointments. Some young people were struggling to get access to IT, and obviously that's a very current issue that we're grappling with. And by the time it came to the post-test, we realised there wasn't any point because we hadn't had the engagement, we hadn't had a robust enough pre-test, and effectively the whole thing kind of collapsed. The feedback from the participants, teachers and mentors was that the platform we were using was excellent. We'd struggled to get young people to sign up because we'd asked for parental sign up on behalf of students. We struggled with the timing of sessions because participants didn't want to stay after school to access the mentoring. The fact that we'd had to restrict the curriculum to one set of concepts limited the interest for participating young people and their teachers. And, as we know in schools, other priorities quickly take over. We also found that participants forgot to book or show up online for the mentoring sessions. So luckily we've taken a period to reflect on that, and although the basic principles of the project we still feel are sound, the implementation and the evaluation issues that we had were ultimately grounded in practical issues. We know that school resources are stretched and school teams weren't able to scaffold and manage their participants as we thought they might, purely because of the kind of overload. Participant self-management didn't work. We did have one very keen pupil who did everything that they could on the project, but for most of the young people participating, they weren't always able to engage as we thought they might do. We also found that participants weren't always able to judge the threshold concepts that they were struggling with without a teacher's advice. And because of the scale of the project, we weren't able to offer the kind of bespoke, targeted curriculum material that we wanted to do. So we've concluded that schools and participants need much more scaffolding and support. So we need to resource it better next time. So next time we try any of these kind of projects, we'll be much more mindful of the challenges that schools experience, the challenges for working with students. We'll be much more proactive about scaffolding the experience for participants themselves, so that they understand the process and they understand the kind of engagement that would work best for them. And also that we'll make sure we have the input and resourcing available from the start. And those are the references to the two papers I mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Gino now.
Thanks, Julian. And yeah, so anyone who doesn't know me, hello, my name is Gino Graziano. And I wanted to say, because I can see there's quite a few people on the call who I actually do know. And those of you that don't, I really do consider to be part of a wider community. So I wanted to just kick off by saying I hope everyone is well, and I hope those close to you are well too. I'm talking today about an instance which has led to a really deeply held conviction and principle that I've got about widening participation. So it's less about the evaluation of it and more, I guess, about the reflection on it for the context. It's been a 10-year journey really from when I did this project to now, and along the way, there's been quite a few steps that have added into the development of this idea. So it's kind of a little bit different to the previous two examples, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. Julian? So I want to start off by being a really like rubbish Gordon Gekko and saying failure is good if you learn from it. So obviously there's absolutely nothing wrong with getting things wrong. That's part and parcel of life. Things don't go according to plan all the time. Obviously the key thing is to take that thing, reflect on it, and actually make it work next time round, or at least do things differently next time round. I'm starting off with some observations. And the first one, when I was reviewing these slides earlier, I think the first one is actually probably a bit unfair and probably a bit needlessly provocative. But what I meant by this when I wrote it was that this sense of evaluation, this sense of reflection wasn't built in my opinion, to widening participation from the start. We kind of, in my opinion, came a little bit cart before the horse. Evaluation came late to the party, and I am of that generation that was well into doing my practice before anyone even started talking about sort of doing a happy sheet at the end of a visit or whatever it might have been. And if I'm totally honest, saw it as an inconvenience and something that was there to be, if not cheated, reframed to make my project look decent. I'm going back about 15 years, so it's nothing, it's beyond the statute of limitations, I think. But essentially, evaluation wasn't something that was built into how I did my practice. I was what I've heard Chris talk about as an accidental practitioner in that sense. Very much, in my opinion, we had a situation up until recently, and maybe some might even think it's still there, of this almost like practice versus research, or practice versus theory, where people can get a little bit defensive depending on which side of the fence they are about what people say about a particular issue in widening participation. The first time I ever thought about evaluation in a really joyful sense, and I really mean that word as well, was when I went to the last Why Evaluate conference that Julian ran, where for the first time ever I'd heard about evaluation in the sense of being exciting and kind of really wanting to sort of test things and push things and understand things. And I found that really, really inspiring, to properly want to change your project, to want to push it and want to take it as far as it can go. And I thought that was a really, really refreshing way of thinking about evaluation. And when I thought about that even further, I thought that really insight comes from discomfort, and that leads into the project I'm going to talk about. But even when I think about it, when I'm being asked by my 5-year-old, like, why is it like that? But why is it like that? But why? But why? But why? And often when I'm in those type of conversations, I come to some quite profound realizations about, yeah, actually, why? So I think that kind of discomfort of really pushing ourselves and testing ourselves and asking us, like, well, why are we doing it like this? It can lead to some really, really interesting points. So the case study I'm going to talk about is a working class boys project. I'm not going to name it because I don't want to infer that there was anything wrong with the project. The framework actually was excellent, and it was developed by an old colleague of mine who I've got a real lot of time for. He's really ahead of himself, ahead of the game on this, Chris Derbyshire, who worked for Aim Higher at the time and was really exploring some of these things. As Chris said, the first time it was in fashion, because these things do come out in cycles. The first time it was in fashion, Chris was really on the forefront of this. So the project itself was really good, and I don't want to infer that it was poor. What I think was the element of failure was what I brought to the table, and I'll explain a little bit more about that now. So this is going back in the mists of time, 2009 to 2011. And really what it was about was working with Year 9 boys to re-engage them with education using the language of the time, as Chris talked about earlier. And essentially what it was I was like a franchise, like a McDonald's franchise for this particular thing in my university. It was a series of sequential trips which were kind of interlinked to try and re-engage boys with education. And the point was to try and challenge, motivate and re-engage them. But there were problems throughout. And if I'm honest, like from really early on, I was really aware that there wasn't this connection between myself as the project leader and the boys who were on the program. There was a continuing and declining lack of engagement and lack of people turning up at my sessions. You know, I'd complain about it, but nothing happened and all this kind of stuff. If I'm honest, like when the boys did show up, they weren't engaged. When they did engage, it was because I sensed they felt sorry for me. So lots of things were not right about this project. There was a presentation at the end where the students would come and show and tell what they'd learned from the experience. And when it came to it, none of my lads showed up, and I had to stand there and say in front of like 100 people, "I'm sorry, my lads haven't decided not to come." So it was awful. It was a real burn. It was a real fail. So Julian, next slide, please. So this led to what I think politicians refer to as a period of introspection, where I was like, well, who's to blame for this? Like, you know, is it the school? Because they were not really engaged with it, if I think about it. Was it the lads? They didn't know what's good for them. You know, how dare they think that this thing I'm bringing to them is not worth their time and attention? But if I'm honest, it was me, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But the other thing about this project was I loved this project. Like, I really, really, really wanted it to work. Like, this was probably the first project that came along. By that point, I've been in WP about 8 years. The first one that my heart was in. I really wanted it to work, and that's what made this period of introspection like doubly painful, because I was passionate about it, you know. So when it came to the question of carry on or drop it, I really, really, really wanted it to carry on. So I had to sit down for some honest reflection, for some honest thoughts about why it hadn't worked. And as I say, the buck really did stop with me. The framework was great. Chris Derbyshire had done a fabulous job of coming up with the framework. But what I hadn't done was apply my own passion that I think I've just articulated to you into this project. So I just essentially lifted it off the shelf and expected it to work. The other thing that was happening around about this time, which goes into the research bit, was I was getting a little bit more accountability and responsibility at work. I was going to offer conferences. I was sort of like hearing a bit about policy, and I was engaging more with like other networks, community and sector networks and so on. And I started to hear about projects which were much more about bringing agency to the participants, and much more about involving the people in the development of the program and even in the delivery of the program. And I loved that. I was fascinated by that, because the other thing that I had been a bit uncomfortable about up to this point in WP, but I hadn't really articulated in that way, was how we just rock up at schools and do it to people, how we kind of, you know, presume to kind of like understand where these people are coming from and know what's good for them and all this kind of stuff. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. So I recalibrated and started to embed essentially those two things into the program and rebooted it for the next cohort. So off you go, Julian. So we changed the emphasis. As I say, I tried to put myself into the framework and try and put some of that passion that I've just described into how it was delivered, and started to think about how I was going to embed agency and responsibility and give that to the people, the participants in the project. So I'd give them homework where they had to go and do like anonymous good deeds and stuff like that. And what that led to, I think, was, well, not I think, I know, was really, really vastly improved results. So from then on, it was the same constituency of lads. You know, we had 90%, we had 90% attendance on sessions and trips. We had a full complement of the final presentation and so on. It was really, really good. All of a sudden, like, people were engaging with it and stuff. So at that point, unfortunately, what we weren't at that stage in time was a well-developed evaluation plan. So we had our happy sheets and we knew like sort of like what the lads thought of it at the end of the project and stuff, but we didn't have tracking. And obviously Aim High folded around about that sort of time. So we don't have that longer term, longitudinal sort of like evaluation of the project after somebody's finished. And I'd like to probably say that's another lesson that I've learned over the years, is to be able to build that sort of 2 or 3 years retrospection is also been really, really sort of useful, I think, when I've been able to do that. Off you go, Julian. So, as I say, around this time, like, I was articulating all of these type of thoughts together into thinking about what this type of approach was that I was so uncomfortable about, and I started to think about it as the missionary approach. So this idea about turning up and sort of knowing what's best for people and saving them, I guess, from their environment. And I've got a couple of quotes here that sort of reflect that. I've obviously selected them to back up my argument, but essentially this idea that you essentially get, we know what these people need, we need to find them, we need to get there, we need to convert them to our way of thinking. Off you go, Julian. So essentially that was my kind of like practical experience of this stuff, but I was also a beneficiary of the program that Chris and Julian and Ray were talking about earlier, which was the Offer project, which was the SHU project, the Sheffield Hallam project as well. And I got to, for probably the first time, think about the policy discussion here and think about the theoretical discussion. So that, in my mind, sort of like made my ideas go through a triangle of policy, theory, practice. And thinking about the idea that people have low aspirations, or do they? You know, is it a sort of poverty of aspiration, or actually a poverty of expectation, when expectations haven't been actually realised after people trying to achieve that? And then this kind of idea about, again, which, as I say, I'd started to think about, but not in a theoretical way, presuming deficits about people. And then what is the message we're communicating to people about this valorization of middle class values rather than working class values, which Diane Ray talks about. Off you go, Julian. So then I kind of, my next ongoing lesson, my next ongoing part of the lesson was a development of a project that I ran through the local NCOM, Sussex Learning Network at the time, which was about giving students that agency to research this stuff in their own context and their own environments. So they would come up with the questions, and they would go back to their wider families and their wider peer networks to talk about what people thought about higher education, what their thoughts were, and what their position was. And some really interesting themes came out of that I just would not have expected when I first started this. Firstly, the main one, funnily enough, was around pressure and being able to perform, and the expectations that were being set on people, which was really sort of prevalent. The next one was interesting as well, because I'd never actually thought about this either, but it was about the quite a well articulated cynicism around the education system generally, mainly around schools, but by extension universities, that was very well developed in these young people. Finance, unsurprisingly, was there, and then a real kind of quite well articulated discourse around the real world versus university, and that kind of grappling, if you like, within sort of working class communities. So the further lesson I drew here was that we can learn a lot from our audience, essentially. So on the next slide is essentially my kind of insights for what they're worth after sort of 20 years in WP. I really don't like the missionary model. You know, I mean, I think that it's something that I'm uncomfortable about when I'm talking to people, when I'm delivering in that way. You know, I'm sure, like a lot of people on this call, have had parents sort of challenging me on it a few times, and it's always felt difficult. I've had it in my private and personal life, found it quite hard to defend to parents and friends and so on. A lot of what we do traditionally, maybe not now so much, but traditionally has been based on the assumptions of people who perhaps haven't been through this kind of pathway themselves. Although I guess we are here to help people for sure, but I also think we need to be honest, and I think we need to honestly say that we can learn a lot from the people that we're working with. We need their help to do it with them rather than to them, I guess, which is ultimately the bottom line. I believe that we need to bring everybody, our audience, into all stages of our work. So there's a lot of obviously talk about co-creation at the moment, but there's a really massive value in co-research, co-design, co-delivery especially, and co-evaluation as well. And that's something that I really think the sector needs to work on at every level. As I say, the main lesson that I've drawn from all of this is that agency is effective. And I think that by giving our audience agency rather than making them subjects of our work, we are likely to see better results. And finally, I guess the main thing which kind of started all this in the beginning is I do think we need to be really mindful and respectful of people's culture and backgrounds, and particularly of, as Chris talked about earlier, local working class environments. And I was going to finish off on a final thought, which is this quote, and anyone who knows me will have seen this quote a million times, but this is from Alan Moore, one of my heroes, from fellow Northamptonian. He's talking specifically about literature here, written by the middle class, but when they talk about working class people, they either think about them in a sort of lofty contempt, and they sort of talk about the vulgarity of these people, or they talk about them in patronising terms, that these people are victims. And he finishes off by saying, of course, working class people don't see themselves like that. Everybody is a hero in their own narrative. And I think that that's kind of what I would hope for WP, is that we can switch it around to make people agents in what we do rather than simply subjects.
Okay, thanks, Gino. And just to wrap up and to just return to the start when we're thinking about this kind of reflexive process in the context of COVID-19. I've been really influenced by Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and particularly the kind of observation that as humans, we can't constantly be thinking about our environment and the context. So we reduce the cognitive load by developing rules of thumb or heuristics, which means we don't have to rethink things. We've got a preformed model in our minds. But at the same time, if we are being reflexive in the way that Chris and Gino have talked about, this ability to look back and reflect in the space to learn and think and do something different offers us a new way out. Given the current situation that we're in, COVID-19's broken everything, we've got an opportunity to rethink how we approach what we do, whether it's outreach, delivery or evaluation. We can rethink everything, and this could be transformative if we take it going forward. And I've just included a diagram of the loop between intervention and evaluation, and how we should make sure that they both constantly inform each other. And
Thanks, Julian. As I say, I think we have got very, very little time. We're 1 minute over already. Chris has done a phenomenal job of responding to questions in the text box. I think everybody who asked Chris a question has had a personal answer, which is fantastic. The other theme that I would bring out is one around the practicalities of co-creation, and what does that really look like? My sense is that there isn't a quick answer to that. I do wonder though, and Julian, I'm looking for you to nod or just give me that, it's the scream emoji expression. That would be the making of a really good blog. So if we're doing blogs on our website, on the Villas Park website, following the Why Evaluate conference, so they'll all be coming up shortly, then actually some specific working around what does co-creation look like and how do you do it well, I think might be the better way to answer that question, rather than try to do it hurriedly and badly now. Which leads me just to say thank you to everybody for joining us, and thank you particularly for our three speakers. Fantastic presentations, really, really interesting, hence us running all the way to the end. I love the idea of joyful evaluation, and it speaks to me of, I think of the courage that it takes to do evaluation, and the kind of work that we're talking about now, where you evaluate and you engage in discussions around things that haven't worked, that don't fit with your view of how the world works. requires you as the evaluator to be vulnerable, particularly when you are reflecting on your own work and things that haven't worked the way that you want, or when you're sharing your work with somebody else who is an independent evaluator, which sounds lovely and clinical, but the experience of having your work evaluated in that way can feel violent and aggressive sometimes. So creating spaces where we can be courageous and curious to really think about the way that we're working and how we can choose to do things differently in the future and take on that agency ourselves, I think is really, really important. And absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, Gino, leads to joyful evaluation. And you don't really get the joyful bit without doing some of that risk taking. So thank you for sharing that with us. That was really powerful. Thank you, the three panelists, for taking your time out to contribute to this discussion today, and thank you also to the audience. I'm so sorry we didn't get time to ask any individual questions at the end, but I'm aware people will want to go and get a sandwich before they get on with the rest of their day.